And I need to make sure that it's on the recording. Thank you, Mom, for the new outfit. I just got back from Ohio and my mom bought me this. So, little ministerial clothes from Mom. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks. So once again, Spirit planted this idea for a talk about Into the Silence, and as I explored it, I went on a little journey. So strap in, here we go. It started with this. You need not leave your room. Remain sitting at your table and listen. You need not even listen. Simply wait. Just learn to become quiet and still and solitary. The world will freely offer itself to you to be unmasked. It has no choice. It will roll in ecstasy at your feet. So I've got the sitting still part down, and I've actually got the being solitary thing down. It's the waiting. It's the waiting and the waiting in the quiet. However, look at the reward, if I can get that. The world will roll in ecstasy at my feet. It's definitely something worth striving for. So there's a lot to be said for silence. Sitting in the silence, silent retreats, all things related to silence. And here's the deal about getting into the silence, is that it may not actually be very quiet once you get there. And this has always been my somewhat futile argument about totally silent meditation. The truth is, I just don't really enjoy it. However, my very futile argument is that there's really no such thing as total silence. Folks will run off to the woods, go camping to have some peace and quiet, and then they'll be kept up all night by crickets, or as my friend used to call it, ruckuses in the woods. And even when I sit in silence in the house where I live, it's not silent. There's the hum of the refrigerator, there are the neighbor kids screaming, there's squirrels dropping things on the roof, and of course, Maddie snoring. So what I realized is that to get into the silence is truly an inside job. When Heather and I went to the Grand Canyon, we were on the Colorado River for 15 days inside the canyon. And one day, everybody else went off on a hike. And by this time on the journey, we were about a little more than halfway through, and the guides had figured out two very important things about me. One, I don't go on hikes. And two, I'm safe to be left alone. Because that was their big thing, is everybody has to go or somebody has to stay back with people because of dangers. And by this time, they'd realized how stubborn I am. And so they were like, you know what, we're all just going to go. You'll be fine. I'm like, yes, I will. So they left me alone, except for these two lizard pals on my rock with me, my two visitors, and the river. And so at first I just sat on the rock in silence, and then I prayed, and then I listened, and then I started singing. And it was actually one of the most blissful into the silence moments that I've ever experienced. And it wasn't quiet at all. Thich Nhat Hanh says, silence is something that comes from your heart, not from the outside. Silence doesn't mean not talking and not doing things. I love this. It means that you are not disturbed inside. If you're truly silent, then no matter what situation you find yourself in, you can enjoy the silence. So let's run with this for a moment. Have any of you ever been in a situation, maybe a party or an environment where the noise level is just really, really high, and you couldn't leave, but maybe you, like I do, kind of retreat into your own private silence amidst the chaos and noise? And it's this inner world that's always there and it's always available. And that to me is the real message of getting into the silence, is finding it there. I mean, because anybody can go away from the noise. And I will clarify, there is one place on the planet that I have found that is completely silent, and that's inside a float tank, an isolation tank. But even then, there's a filter. And occasionally you'll hear the filter, but very rarely. So that's one place. We found one. But many people they go to mountaintops or they go to cabins, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, Brother Francesco used to leave the chaos and noise of 1200 Assisi and go up the mountain to his cave. But even he wasn't in silence, because he writes that, well, I'll get to that later. But he used to go to his cave quite often. And so it's much more challenging, I think, and it's much more the call to be able to stay in the world and find the silence. Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of my favorite souls who ever walked the planet. And what I really love about him is he and Thoreau knew each other, and actually Thoreau hung out on Emerson's property for a while when he was in the woods roughing it, and he would go to Emerson's house and eat. And so he kind of slammed Thoreau a little bit without saying his name, but in his self-reliance lecture, he wrote, "It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But it is the great man or person, that is the one who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of his solitude." Little to Thoreau there. So the truth is, it's a big, noisy world. And it's filled with big, noisy stuff. So how do we find that solitude, that silence that we need to refill and refuel? So I found this. The soul always knows what to do to heal itself. The challenge is to silence the mind. Yeah. So the trick is finding the silence. So last October, we did some talks based on the book The 10 Challenges by Leonard Felder. And it was his take, for those of you who weren't here, it was his perspective on the 10 Commandments, and that they weren't actually commandments. That the Aramaic translation is challenges. They were 10 challenges posed by God to say, can you do these things? As opposed to, you must do these things. And one of the challenges was in regards to keeping the Sabbath day holy, Shabbat, keeping that holy. And he had some suggestions on how to do that, and one of them was a technology holiday. And some of you have tried this. I've seen people on Facebook going, hey, taking a Facebook break, see you in a couple weeks, or an undefined amount of time. And so it's very powerful to take even just 24 hours, to take a Sabbath, 24 hours, away from the phone, the laptop, Facebook, TV, radio, even the Kindle. Because, we still do have books that we can actually pick up and read. Every so often, I just like to touch a book. And so then you just get all that outer technology out of the way, and you let your inner technology do what it does. It's literally a reboot. So another really cool thing about that Grand Canyon trip was that it was a technology-free zone. I'm one of those people that I fall asleep to things, either to music, or I play a little game on my phone or something to shut my mind off, to get this chatter to stop and to get my eyes tired. And here we were going out on this trek, and I'm like, I'm never going to sleep. I'm going to be out in the wild, of the Grand Canyon, and it's going to be quiet, and I'm never going to sleep. Of course, it wasn't quiet. The crickets were insane. But it was, it was this leaving the phone behind. We packed up our stuff and put the phone down. And 15 days later, when I picked my phone back up, it felt strange in my hand. That's all it took, was 15 days. It was like, I don't remember how I used to hold it. And I actually couldn't remember how to use it. It was very interesting. It was like, things that had become so habitual had suddenly vanished. So it doesn't take long. So we can find a way to get away from things to get in the silence. We can take away the technology. We can stay home and find it. We can also find that silence within us when we drive. We can find it at work. And although I don't recommend it, we can find it while grocery shopping. I did an experiment with grocery shopping in the silence, and I ended up with a lot of food that I didn't know that I bought. I'm like, I don't remember putting this in the cart. So maybe not grocery shopping. But so getting back to Brother Francesco, one of the things that I loved about him is that he did go in retreat away from town, away from the brothers, away from the drama. And he would climb Mount Subasio, and he would get to this place called Eremo della Carceri, which was this beautiful, woodsy retreat away from the world. And he would hang out in his cave, and he would talk to God. And so he got away from the noise of town, and he got into the silence, and yet again, it wasn't quiet. He wrote about how he would commune with the birds. The tree, actually, that he used to stand in front of is still there. They've built supports for it so it would stay standing. And that's where he used to talk to the birds. He would talk, he would cry, he would sing to God, and he would listen to the rain. He would sit in the cave and just listen to the rain. And so that is another piece of this getting into the silence, is the listening. It's the listening part. And I could do a whole talk about listening, which I'll eventually get to. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on listening to ourselves. However, if you are free at 11 o'clock today, it just so happens, because there are no coincidences, that Don Fleming will be talking about listening to our still small voice in the silence over at the Alaska Center today at 11. Yeah, we were laughing about that. That's why we're talking about the same stuff. But have you ever heard anybody say, or have you said, I've said, stop talking to me, I need to hear myself think? What a fascinating statement. I need to hear myself think. I need to shut out the noise to hear that. Or, like if you've gotten lost in the car, you have to turn the radio off because there's just too much noise, too much chaos. And there's an inner listening, there's an into the silence, there's an inner experience that you need to connect with, I need to connect with, and I just have to shut out everything else. So when we allow the silence, it's actually amazing what we begin to hear. And I love this line. The quieter you become, the more you can hear. So again, the journey continued, and I started thinking about the uses of silence and when we can actually use silence. And I thought about the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. And for those of you who are detail-oriented, you will notice that the director made a very wise choice, that when Tom Hanks arrives at that island, there's no musical score. From the entire time he arrives to when he is rescued. There's no music. There's no sweeping, dramatic strings or, gorgeous soundtrack. There's nothing except the sounds of him and the island. Coconuts falling, the wind blowing, the surf. And so when he speaks, it's jarring because that's all he's hearing and that's all we're hearing. And we experience that incredible isolating silence with him. It's a powerful choice. It made it so much more rich, and it would have taken away from it if he'd woken up in the morning and there was this beautiful string quartet playing on the island. So it brought the silence to us and brought us into his silence. So there were a couple more aspects of silence that struck me as I was looking at this, and also a couple of them came to me in the shower, which proves yet again I need a waterproof recorder in my shower. Brilliant ideas in the shower. So there's this idea of silence that's brought to us, silence that is thrust upon us, for lack of a better word, silence that we don't want. And perhaps it's the silence that happens after a beloved person dies. a friend, an animal companion. That echoing silence of when a relationship ends or somebody moves away. And some change has taken place, and it's taken the sound from our environment with it. It's an unwilling entrance into a silence. My first experience with this was in the house that I grew up in. It's an old Georgian-style home. It was built in like 19-something. And it wasn't a mansion. It was, however, large. It's a big house. And there were 6 of us, my 3 older sisters and my parents, and the occasional dog, cat, and a lot of guinea pigs. And our house was the house. It was the gathering place. We had family seders there, huge Thanksgivings there. We had a big party room. We had 2, I know it sounds extravagant, but we had 2 baby grand pianos. We had a Chickering from my mom's side and a Steinway from my dad's side, back to back in our party room. So there was always music, and there was always laughter and lively conversation and activity. There was always something happening. My sisters and I did community theater, and we were the cast party house. You know, it was like we were the house. And so there was just always a lot of sound and stuff and music, always. And then by the time I was in high school, I was living in that house by myself. My 2 oldest sisters were out living their life. My 3rd sister was in college. My dad had graduated from Earth School when I was 12, so he was gone. And my mom had moved into the place with her soon-to-be new husband. And I was alone in this house. And it was an experience of silence that caused me to really not like silence. It was a silence put on me that I did not choose. And that house is amazing. It is so haunted. It was around that same time that the movie Poltergeist came out, and I had to have a slumber party because I'm like, seriously, my house is the house in Poltergeist. But it was not a quiet silence. That's, I think, why. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a chaotic silence, and I sometimes felt like the silence was chasing me through the house. However, I will say that I have to take credit for being creative, because back then we had actual telephones, like phones with the... We didn't have rotary, we did have push buttons, so we weren't that, But I invented the first mobile phone, because back then we also didn't have answering machines, voicemail, or caller ID. So if the phone rang and I didn't get it, I didn't know who called, I didn't know why they called, and there was no way to know. And when a phone rang in that house, it literally broke through the silence. So I went out and bought as many extension cords as I could, and I was never anywhere in that house without a phone. I would just carry it around with me into the bathroom, over here, over there. So I actually invented the first mobile phone. I'm just saying, silence is the mother of invention. I needed that with me. So then one last reflection on silence. When we went to Assisi, Italy, everywhere you go in Assisi is a holy site. Everywhere. I mean, pretty much everywhere. And in all of these holy sites, they have signs that remind the visitor, you're in a holy site, please be quiet, please proceed in silence. And even outdoors, as folks approached San Damiano, which is the little church that Brother Francesco built, there's a sign posted, and it says, "Sacred area, San Damiano, silence, respect." And then there's a sign on the other end, as you're coming in from the other side, that reminds you that the Sisters of St. Clare are still living, working, and praying there. So please honor that with your silence. So it's a no talking zone, and that sign is posted like a good ways away. So like as you're entering the actual complex, it's a no talking zone. So this is where you separate the pilgrims from the tourists. Because tourists go tromping through these sacred spaces, and they're shaking their umbrellas, and they're stomping their feet, and they're glancing around briefly, giving a little grunt, like, and then moving on to their next meal. Basically, that's their experience. Pilgrims, on the other hand, tread lightly and softly, and they're humble in their approach, and they're tender in their gaze. And they sit for long periods of time remembering that the air that they're breathing is the same air as people who were there hundreds of years ago. And pilgrims tend to be very quiet. So this is a nighttime photo of Sister Clare's Basilica. But during the day, we walked through there. That's where the cross is hanging that talked to Brother Francis and told him to rebuild the church. And it's a very sacred place. It's also a huge tourist attraction. And so we were walking through there, and we noticed some people were talking to each other, and I was like, silently judging. And then we hear this voice, an amplified male voice, gentle yet firm, slightly husky, and it says, "Silencio." And my first thought is, God is telling these people to shut up. That's so cool. And then we looked around and we noticed a very handsome man in a very tailored Italian suit walking around with a wireless mic. This is his gig. He walks through the church and on occasion says, "Silencio," to remind everyone gently yet firmly to shut up because it's a sacred place. And I love that. I want that gig. Like, I want to go, can I apply for the Silencio gig? Because I think that's awesome. So here's what we've learned. Silence is not always quiet. Silence is something that we discover and can access from within us. Discovering that silence within us requires patience and possibly some sitting and waiting. Silence is about listening. Silence is sometimes a choice, and sometimes it's thrust upon us. Silence can sometimes feel scary, and silence can also motivate us to create new ways in dealing with it. And inevitably, and most importantly, silence is sacred. Robert Lawrence Smith wrote in a Quaker Book of Wisdom, "In silence we can discover the divine within, which is universally accessible, but speaks to each of us in a unique voice. If we can locate at the very center of silence our individual, still small voice, we will have found our greatest ally in life. Because if we listen to that voice with an open heart, it will guide us through the most challenging crossroads of our lives. In work, in love, in distinguishing right from wrong. We need only trust the voice that speaks to us out of the silence." So let's take a moment to commune with that. Oh, taking a sacred breath. Here's what I know. That the thing that I call God has many names. And it expresses itself in many, many ways. And as each person connects to that experience and that name and that invitation and that essence and that expression of whatever it is that I call God, there is a connection and a moment of peace And not just the word peace as it's thrown around every day. I mean peace with a capital P, a silence, a stillness, a solidness. It's that experience of stillness and silence that lets us know now is not the time to say that next thing. It's a silence that guides us. It's a silence that shows us who we are, where we are, and where the next step is. Taking a moment to go into the silence is a gift we can give to ourselves. It's not something we have to get on our knees for. It's not something we have to go to a building for. It's not something that we have to ask for. It's an invitation being offered to us 24/7. Spirit, God, love, oneness, whatever we call it, is saying, join me in the silence, won't you? Won't you please join me in the silence so that we can discover together who we are and what we do and what we should do next. And so for anyone who is moving through a time of challenge or confusion or complication, I invite all of us to accept the invitation and say, okay, I will go into this silence, this not so quiet silence, and I will listen, and I will wait, and I will sit patiently. And I will know. I will know what I need to know when I need to know it. I will trust the silence. I will trust the silence. So with gratitude, I hold each and every person who has reached out in prayer, knowing that as the prayer was requested, it is answered. And I know that each of these stones that carries a prayer is cherished and cared for and nurtured and loved, so that each person in this room can walk out free and clear. I give thanks for that opportunity. I give thanks for the silence. I give thanks for the reminders. And I give thanks for this life. Amen and Ashe.